There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a forest when something is dying inside it. Not the usual quiet of night, not the peaceful absence of sound that comes when the wind rests between gusts, and the birds have tucked themselves into their branches. This is a different silence altogether, heavier and more deliberate, the kind that the trees themselves seem to hold like a breath they are afraid to release. Animals feel it first, the small ones with their exquisite sensitivity too. Disturbance. The rabbits that freeze in their burrows and the owls that cease their hunting and simply watch from their high perches with wide, unblinking eyes. Something is wrong in the forest tonight. Something that should not be broken is breaking, and the whole world has paused to witness it. Lyra Ashwood heard it too, though she would not have been able to explain how. She was inside her cabin when the feeling came over her. That particular prickling awareness at the back of her neck that she had learned years ago not to dismiss. She had been working by lamplight, grinding dried valerian root into powder with the same patient rhythm she brought to every task. Her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her bare feet warm against the stone floor. The cabin smelled of herbs and wood smoke and something clean and green that had no name she knew of, and she had been perfectly content in that moment, perfectly at peace, until suddenly she was not. She set down the mortar and pestle and stood very still. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and for a moment she heard nothing unusual, only the ordinary music of the mountain at night. But then the wind shifted, and she heard it, barely audible, a sound so low and so full of suffering that it carved itself directly into the center of her chest, without passing through her ears at all. It was a sound like a living thing at the very edge of everything, and it was coming closer. Lyra did not hesitate. She had lived on the margins of the Iron Peak territory for 4 years, long enough to understand that the forest kept its own rules, and that survival within it required a certain quality of immediate response. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and took her lantern from the hook beside the door and walked outside into the cold autumn night, following that sound the way a compass needle follows north, without decision, without doubt, simply because it could not do anything else. She found him at the edge of the tree. Lying, perhaps 20 feet from her front door, collapsed in the long grass where the forest met the small clearing she had cultivated around her home. She almost did not recognize what she was looking at, because her mind kept trying to impose a familiar shape onto what her eyes were showing her, and the shapes would not match. He was enormous. That much was immediately clear. A wolf of a size that no natural wolf should be. His silver-gray coat matted dark with blood that had soaked through, too, the earth beneath him. He had dragged himself this far, and no further. And now he lay on his side with his legs moving in slow, weakening motions that broke her heart even as she watched. She should have been afraid. Any reasonable person with any reasonable instinct for self-preservation would have backed slowly into the cabin, bolted the door, and waited until morning to investigate what was already almost certainly a corpse. Lyra Ashwood had never been particularly reasonable in that particular way. She crossed the clearing and knelt beside him in the wet grass and set her lantern down and put her hand on his side without thinking about it at all, and she felt the heat of his fever through her palm, like pressing her hand against a forge, and she felt the stuttering labor of his breathing, and she felt something else beneath all of that, something she had no name for, a vibration or a resonance, or simply a recognition that passed between her hand and his ribs and settled in, her bones like a key finding its lock. "I have you," she said, to the wolf or to herself or to the night at large, and she meant it completely. If you are already feeling something in your chest right now, I promise you this story is only just beginning. Stay with me. The wolf survived the first night because of stubbornness as much as anything else. Lyra had assessed his wounds with the methodical focus she brought to every medical situation she encountered, whether it was a hawk with a broken wing or a feral cat with an infected bite, and what she found made her jaw tighten and her hands move faster. The wounds themselves were numerous, the kind of deep lacerating injuries that came from a sustained and vicious attack, rather than any single incident. But it was what lay within the wounds that troubled her most. She had treated metal-poisoned injuries before. in small animals that had encountered traps or environmental contamination, and she recognized the blackened, suppurating quality of the tissue around the deepest cuts. Whatever had caused these wounds had left something behind, something that the body was fighting with every resource it had and losing. She worked through the night without stopping, cleaning each wound with a solution of her own preparation, drawing out the contamination with poultices of activated charcoal and healing clay, and 3 different plants she had cultivated specifically because of their demonstrated ability to bind and neutralize foreign substances in living tissue. She applied honey to the cleaned wounds, pure raw honey from a hive she kept herself, which had properties that most people outside of traditional medicine had entirely forgotten. She brewed tea from carefully measured combinations of immune-supporting herbs, and got it into him by a method she preferred not to examine too closely, which involved a great deal of patience and a hollowed gourd, and the wolf's apparent decision, somewhere in the depths of his fever, to trust her. It was while she was working that she noticed the way his body healed. She had cleaned a wound on his flank and turned to her supply table for more of the honey, and when she turned back, the edges of the wound had already begun to draw together in a way that no ordinary wolf's tissue could have managed in that time frame. She sat with this observation for a moment, examining what it meant, and then she added it to the growing collection of things about this animal that did not conform to the natural world as she understood it, and she continued working. She had always found that the most effective response to impossible things was simply to proceed. By morning, he was still alive. His breathing had steadied from the terrifying, shallow gasping of the previous night into something slower and deeper and more sustainable. The fever was still high, but no longer the catastrophic level that had frightened her most in those first hours. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, this enormous, impossible creature lying on the thick blanket she had dragged from her own bed and spread beneath him on the cabin floor, and she felt something she had not expected, which was relief so sharp it was nearly painful. "You are going to be difficult, aren't you?" she said, which was not a question. The wolf opened one eye, pale silver gray and ancient, and entirely too intelligent, and looked at her for a long moment before closing it again. "Yes," Lyra said, to no one in particular. "I thought so." She named him Ash because of his coloring, and because she needed something to call him, and because names had a power she had always respected. She did not tell him this at first, simply began using it in the stream of quiet, one-sided conversation she kept up as she moved around the cabin through the first day, and then the second, narrating her actions in a low voice, the way she did with all her patients, on the theory that familiar sound was soothing, and that being spoken to like an intelligent being was always preferable to being spoken to like an object. "I am going to change the dressing on your shoulder now, Ash," she would say, and her hands would be already moving, gentle and practiced and completely unafraid, and she would watch the subtle shift in his body language that she had begun to learn to read, the way tension moved through his frame and either released or held, depending on what she was doing and how, and she adjusted her touch. Accordingly, he was conscious for longer periods by the second day, watching her with those extraordinary eyes that held an intelligence she found both compelling and slightly unnerving in the way that all genuinely sharp minds were slightly unnerving, because you never quite knew what they were thinking. He watched her grind herbs and brew remedies and move efficiently around the small space with the focused economy of someone who had organized their life to function exactly as it needed to. He watched her eat a simple meal at her table and read by lamplight and tend to the small pot of climbing roses on her windowsill that were inexplicably still blooming despite the season. He watched her with a quality of attention that was different from the watching of an animal, and she pretended not to notice, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging things she was not yet ready to acknowledge. On the third day, he shifted. She was outside gathering the last of the seasons, medicinal mushrooms from the base of the big oak at the edge of her clearing when she heard the sound from inside the cabin, a sound that was part groan and part something else entirely, low and resonant and deeply human. She straightened slowly and turned toward the cabin and took one breath, and then walked back inside with the same measured calm she would have brought to any situation requiring it. He was lying on the blanket in human form. He was, she noted with the clinical detachment she was capable of producing on demand, quite extraordinarily large in human form as well. Broad-shouldered and long-limbed, and built on a scale that suggested the wolf form was not so much a transformation as a translation. The same essential reality expressed in a different language. He was also, she noted with slightly less clinical detachment, completely without clothing, which she had expected, and conscious, which she had not, and looking at her with those same silver-gray eyes that had watched her so intently for 3 days, and were now watching her with an expression she could not fully read, but which contained, she thought, equal parts wariness, and something that might have been the very beginning of wonder. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she crossed to the chest at the foot of her bed, and pulled out the clothes she kept there for emergencies, and set them on the edge of the blanket without comment, and went to her stove to heat the broth she had prepared that morning, and gave him the privacy of her back while he sorted himself out. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and roughened from disuse and fever, and it landed in her spine like a struck chord. "The broth will be ready in a few minutes," she said, because this seemed like the most useful thing to say. "You should try to sit up if you can." There was a silence, and then the sound of slow, painful movement, and then he said, "My name is Calum." She ladled broth into a bowl. "I know who you are," she said, which was true in the way that everyone in a 3-mountain radius knew who the Alpha of Iron Peak was. The way you knew the name of a storm or a landmark, something so present in the landscape of your life that it required no introduction. Another silence. "You knew what I was," he said. It was not quite a question. "Not immediately," she said honestly, turning to bring him the bowl. "By the end of the first night?" "Yes." She met his eyes as she held out the bowl and watched something shift. In his expression, at the steadiness in hers. "Drink. You are still running a low fever, and you lost a significant amount of blood. Your body needs resources to continue healing." He took the bowl from her hands, and their fingers did not quite touch, and she was almost certain she felt the warmth of his skin from 2 inches away, which she attributed to fever and proximity, and nothing else whatsoever. He drank. "Are you already asking yourself how a human woman ended up living alone on the edge of werewolf territory for 4 years, with absolutely no protection and no apparent fear?" Because Calum Voss was asking himself the exact same question, and he was going to get answers. Just not yet. Comment below what you think her secret is. I see every single one of your theories, and some of you are already frighteningly close. The story of how Calum Voss came to be bleeding out in the forest outside a solitary cabin at the edge of his own territory was a story about trust and its betrayals, which are always the most devastating kind of story, because they require that something precious existed before it was destroyed. He had been Alpha of Iron Peak for 6 years, since his father's death from a challenge he had not survived, and he had ruled the way he had been raised to rule, with absolute authority and the expectation of absolute loyalty, and very little examination of whether these were the right foundations on which to build a community of several hundred people who had complex inner lives and legitimate grievances and needs that went beyond the simple requirement to obey. He was not cruel, exactly. He had never been the kind of alpha who ruled through terror, who used pain as a management tool, who derived pleasure from the submission of those beneath him. But he was cold in the way that people who have learned that emotion is vulnerability tend to be cold. And he was distant in the way that people who have learned that closeness leads to loss tend to be distant. And he was absolute in his authority in the way that people who have never had their authority genuinely questioned tend to be, which is to say completely and without any awareness that this might be a problem. The conspiracy had been building for 2 years before it came to its head. And the cruelest part was that he had seen the signs and misread them. He had noticed the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He had felt the shift in the quality of deference from certain of his betas, something subtly off in it, a performance where there had been genuine respect before. He had observed that 3 of his inner circle, Marcus, his head enforcer, Delia, his territorial administrator, and Rowan, who had been his father's most trusted advisor and whom Calum had inherited along with everything else, had begun spending time together outside of their official capacities in ways they were clearly attempting to conceal. He had noted all of this, and he had decided, because it was easier, and because he did not want to examine what it would mean if he were right, that he was being paranoid. He had not been paranoid. They had been planning his removal from power, and the installation of Marcus as Alpha, under the guidance of a rival pack whose territory bordered Iron Peak's eastern edge. A pack that had been attempting to absorb Iron Peak for a generation, and had finally found the purchase point it needed in the resentment of 3 people who felt that Calum's leadership was taking the pack in the wrong direction. They were not entirely wrong about that, which was the part that sat in his chest like a splinter even now. They were completely, unforgivably wrong about the method they had chosen to correct it. The ambush had been elegant in its planning and devastating in its execution. They had called him to an emergency meeting at the eastern border under the pretense of a territorial incursion, which was the one thing guaranteed to bring him out, without his full guard. They had been waiting for him at the location, with silver-laced weapons and numbers sufficient to overwhelm even an Alpha's defensive capability, and if the goal had been his death, they would have succeeded. But Marcus, to his credit, or his damnation depending on how you looked at it, had wanted Calum alive and broken and humiliated and stripped of power in a way that would make any future challenge to Marcus's authority look pointless by comparison. What Marcus had not accounted for was Calum's absolute refusal to cooperate with that particular plan. Wounded beyond anything he would have believed survivable, bleeding silver-contaminated blood with every heartbeat, Calum had done the one thing they had not predicted. He had run. Not in retreat, not in defeat, but in the calculating way of a predator who knows that the fight available in this moment is not the fight worth having, and who is already planning the next one. He had run west, away from his territory's center, away from anyone who might be part of the conspiracy or contaminated by it, and the wolf in him had chosen the direction with the certainty of instinct, as though something in that direction was calling, as though the forest itself was pointing the way. He had made it approximately 6 miles before his body refused to carry him any further, and he had collapsed at the edge of a clearing and looked up at the light in a cabin window and thought, with the distant clarity of the severely injured, that this was a strange place to die. He had not died, and now he was sitting on a blanket on a stone floor, drinking broth that tasted extraordinary, and watching a woman move around a small cabin with the kind of complete self-possession that he had only ever seen in people who had survived something significant and come out the other side of it fundamentally intact. And he was trying to understand what he was feeling, which was not something Calum Voss had a great deal of practice doing. What he was feeling, if he had to name it, and he did not want to name it, was safe, which was impossible, which was insane. He was the alpha of a pack that had tried to kill him, lying wounded and weaponless in the home of a human woman he had never met, and he felt safer than he had felt in 6 years of leading, 6 years of constant vigilance and performed certainty, and the exhausting performance of being a thing that did not need anything from anyone. He felt safe in a way that made no strategic sense, and no logical sense, and no sense at all, except the sense that his wolf was making, quietly and implacably, in the deep place beneath thought where the truest things lived. His wolf, which had not been truly quiet in 6 years of chronic threat and responsibility, was lying down. She did not ask him what had happened for the first 2 days of his human consciousness, which he noted and was grateful for, and also found slightly suspicious, because in his experience, people who did not ask questions were either incurious or strategic, and she was clearly not incurious. He watched her watching him, the quick, subtle assessments she made when she thought he was not looking, the way she filed observations away with the efficiency of someone who had learned to read situations accurately as a survival skill rather than an intellectual exercise. On the 4th day, he told her anyway, because the silence had become its own kind of weight and because he realized he wanted her to know. Not the strategic version, not the version he would have told his council or his allies, but the real version, the one that included the part where he had seen the signs and chosen not to look, the part where he had built a leadership so rigid and so isolated that it had created the very conditions that allowed conspiracy to take root. He told her all of it, speaking slowly and with more precision than he was accustomed to, because imprecision felt wrong here, in a way it never had anywhere else. And she listened without interruption, sitting across from him with her knees drawn up to her chest and her dark eyes steady on his face. When he finished, the cabin was quiet for a moment. "You think it was your fault," she said. "Not an accusation. An observation." "Partially," he said. "The conspiracy was not my fault. The conditions that made it possible, those I contributed to." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving information, rather than agreeing with it. "What will you do now?" "Reclaim my territory," he said. "Identify every member of the conspiracy. Dismantle the alliance with the Eastern Pac. Rebuild from a different foundation." He said this with the calm certainty of someone who has been planning in the back of their mind for 4 days and has arrived at conclusions. She was quiet for a moment, studying him. "A different foundation," she repeated. "Yes. What does that mean to you, specifically?" He opened his mouth and found, to his considerable surprise, that the automatic answer he had prepared, which was something about stronger enforcement mechanisms and tighter vetting of inner circle members, did not want to come out. He closed his mouth. He looked at her. He tried again. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the first time in 6 years he had said those words out loud about anything. And the feeling of saying them was so strange, so disorienting, like setting down a weight he had not known he was carrying, that he sat with it in silence for a moment, before he could continue. "I think," he said carefully, "that I have been leading in the wrong direction for a long time, and I don't fully know yet what the right direction looks like." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, with those dark eyes that saw, he was increasingly certain, considerably more than he was comfortable with. "That," she said finally, "is probably the most important thing you could possibly know." The days settled into a rhythm that Calum had not experienced since childhood, and did not know how to resist. Lyra maintained her routines with a consistency he found both grounding and instructive, rising before dawn to tend to her garden and her animals, spending the middle hours of the day in the processing and preparation work of her practice, using the evenings for quieter tasks, reading, writing in the journals she kept in meticulous detail about every plant she grew and every remedy she prepared and every patient she treated. He was. In those journals, he knew, though she did not show him, and he did not ask to see. He helped where he could, which was more limited than he would have preferred, given that his body was still in active repair. But he was a fast healer even by werewolf standards, and by the 5th day he was able to contribute meaningfully to the heavier physical work around the property. She accepted his help without ceremony, without the performance of gratitude that would have made it feel transactional, simply redirected him to what needed doing with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything. And he found, to his bewilderment, that he enjoyed it. He had not done work with his hands, real physical work directed toward practical ends, in 6 years of administrative leadership, and the simplicity of it was a relief he had not known he needed. They talked. This was perhaps the most remarkable part. For a man who had spent 6 years in conversations that were either strategic or performative or both, they talked about everything and nothing, about the properties of the herbs she grew, and the ecology of the forest and the history of the mountain range they were both living on in their different ways. She told him about her childhood in a different part of the country, a coastal town where she had grown up in a household of healers. Her grandmother and her mother both practitioners of traditional medicine, in a lineage she had only begun to understand the depth of. She told him about the 4 years she had spent here, chosen almost by accident, a stopping place on a longer journey that had simply turned out to be the destination. She asked him about his childhood too, and he answered with more openness than he had shown anyone since his father died, perhaps more than he had shown his father. He told her about growing up as an alpha's son, the particular loneliness of it, the way you were simultaneously at the center of everything and apart from everything, trained for a role that required you to be less human in your vulnerabilities than the people you would lead. He told her about his father, who had been a good alpha and a difficult father, and a man he had loved and admired and never quite reached. He told her about the challenge that had killed his father, a young, aggressive wolf from a neighboring pack who had seen an aging alpha and calculated an opportunity, and the particular grief of losing someone to a fight that should never have had to happen. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention that he was beginning to understand was not passivity, but its own kind of activity, an active engagement with what was being offered that made the offering feel valued in a way that elaborate responses often did not. "You have never had anyone to talk to," she said one evening, not unkindly. "I had advisors," he said, "council members, people whose job it was to hear me. That is not what I mean." He looked at the fire. "No," he said. "I know. Have you ever watched someone begin to become themselves? Because that is what this is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because this story is going to go places I genuinely cannot wait to share with you." The first sign that the outside world had not forgotten him came on the 7th day, when Lyra came back from her morning rounds of the property with a different quality of stillness in her movements. The stillness of someone who has encountered something that requires processing. "There are tracks at the southern boundary of my land," she said, setting down her basket with deliberate calm. "Large ones. Several of them. They circled the property sometime last night." Kylam was already at the window, his body oriented outward, with the instinctive readiness of a predator who has been temporarily distracted from being a predator. "How many?" he said. "4 that I could distinguish clearly. Possibly more. Show me." She showed him. He crouched edge of her property where the land changed character from tended to wild and examined the tracks with the focused attention of someone reading a language, which in a sense he was. He read the size and depth and spacing, the way the weight had been distributed, the direction of travel, and the pattern of pause and movement that told the story of what the visitor had been doing and why. "Scout team," he said after a long moment. They were mapping the property, not preparing to enter it. "Reconnaissance." He stood and turned, and his expression had shifted into something harder than what she had seen on his face for the past several days. Something with edges in it. "They will report back. Others will come." "From the conspiracy," she said. "Possibly. Or from members of the pack who are loyal to me and are searching." He looked at her steadily. "Either way, this location is no longer unknown. I have brought this to your door." She met his gaze without flinching. "You are dying." "At my door," she said. "That is a meaningfully different thing. Not to them." His voice had changed too, flatter and more careful. "To them, the fact that you treated me makes you either an asset or a liability, depending on which side is looking. I need you to understand what that means." "I understand what it means," she said, with a quietness in her tone that stopped him. "I have lived on the edge of pack territory for 4 years. I understand exactly how pack politics treat people who exist outside them." She paused. "What I want you to understand is that I made my choices with open eyes. I chose to help you. I choose to continue. Whatever comes from that choice is part of the choice." He stared at her. The hardness in his expression did something complicated and did not quite resolve. "You are remarkably unconcerned about your own safety," he said. "I am remarkably practical about it," she corrected. "There is a difference." He wanted to push back on this, wanted to explain in concrete terms the specific danger she was underestimating, and found that she was looking at him with an expression that suggested she already knew everything he was about to say, and had already made her decision, and that further argument was going to land exactly nowhere. "I need to contact someone," he said instead. "Someone I trust. Tell me what you need." The contact Kylam trusted was a woman named Sable, his youngest beta, and the one member of his inner circle who had not been part of the conversations he had observed between Marcus and Delia and Rowan. Sable was 23 years old and had earned her beta position 2 years ago through a combination of exceptional strategic intelligence and a stubborn personal ethics that made her allergic to political maneuvering for its own sake. He had trusted her then because of her competence. He trusted her now because of an instinct that had never led him wrong when he actually listened to it, which was admittedly not always. The message was simple. A symbol and a location, encoded in the kind of shorthand that only someone who knew both parties well would recognize as a message at all. Lyra helped him identify the right messenger, a red-tailed hawk that visited her property regularly and that she had, apparently, an arrangement with, the kind of arrangement that should not have been possible, and that she explained with a complete lack of defensiveness as simply something she had found worked. "You speak to the hawk," he said, not as a question. "Not speak exactly," she said. "More like a mutual understanding. She knows I will feed her and not harm her. I know she will carry what I ask. It has been this way for about 2 years. That is not something humans do," he said. She gave him a look that was very nearly the first genuinely irritated expression he had seen on her face. "Yes, I'm aware of what humans typically do," she said. "I have been a human for 24 years, and I have some familiarity with the general parameters." He almost smiled. "I did not mean to offend you. You didn't offend me. You surprised me." She tilted her head, studying him. "You have a very fixed idea of what humans are capable of. Most alphas do." "Most alphas are wrong, then." He did almost smile then, the corner of his mouth moving in a way that felt unfamiliar, like a muscle that had not been used in some time. "Yes," he said. "I'm beginning to understand that." Sable arrived 2 days later, alone and in human form, and moving with the aggressive caution of someone who had spent the past 9 days in a state of sustained crisis. She was compact and dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, and she had a cut over her left eyebrow that had been stitched with something that suggested field conditions rather than medical attention. And when she saw Calum standing in the doorway of the cabin, she stopped dead for 3 full seconds, before she moved again, faster, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been holding themselves together with nothing but willpower and has just found the thing they needed to be able to let go. She stopped herself before she reached him. He watched her do it, watched her recalibrate, and he felt something about that recalibration that he had never felt before, which was regret. He had built himself into something that even his most loyal people approached with caution, and that had seemed correct once, had seemed like the right architecture for authority, and it seemed like something different now. "Alpha," she said. Her voice was controlled. "Sable." He stepped forward and closed the remaining distance between them and put his hand on her shoulder, which was not something he would have done 9 days ago. He felt her tension release under his palm, a small seismic thing, and he left his hand there for a moment before he stepped back. "Come inside. Tell me everything." She told him everything. It took over an hour and a second pot of tea and Lyra's quiet presence in the background, present but unobtrusive, refilling cups and producing food that Sable ate with the automatic intensity of someone who has not been eating properly for a week and a half. The picture that emerged from Sable's account was complex, and in some ways worse than he had imagined, and in some ways better. The conspiracy was deeper than he had known. 6 additional pack members beyond the original 3, including 2 who had been with him since the beginning of his leadership. The Eastern Pack Alliance was real and active, with a transfer of territorial rights already drafted and awaiting only the confirmation of his removal from power. The official narrative inside Iron Peak was that Calum had been killed in a territorial incursion, and Marcus was serving as emergency alpha while the succession process was sorted. This narrative was believed by approximately 60% of the pack. The other 40% were suspicious, uncertain, or, in Sable's own small network of trusted contacts, actively working to uncover the truth. "The pack is fracturing," Sable said, her hands wrapped around her 3rd cup of tea. "The younger members especially. They don't have enough history with Marcus to trust him the way the older ones do. And there are things, inconsistencies in the official account, questions about the supposed incursion that don't have good answers. People are asking." She paused. "They want answers, and some of them want you." Calum was quiet for a moment. "What do they want from me specifically?" he said. Sable looked at him with the directness that was one of the things he valued most about her. "They want to know that you're alive, and they want to know what comes next. Those are 2 different questions that require 2 different kinds of answer." He nodded slowly. "Then, because Lyra had been quiet in the corner long enough, and he found that he valued her thinking in a way that was becoming difficult to. Pretend was merely strategic. He turned to her. "What do you think?" he said. She looked mildly surprised at being addressed directly, though she recovered quickly. "I think," she said carefully, "that the most important thing right now is not who leads the pack. It is what the pack understands about what just happened and why, and what they believe about what comes next. Leadership without that understanding is just another form of the same problem." Sable looked at Lyra with an expression that shifted from assessment to something closer to respect in approximately 4 seconds. She looked at Calum. She looked back at Lyra. "Who is this?" she said. "Lyra Ashwood," Lyra said, since Calum appeared to be having some difficulty with the sentence. "I live here. I treated your alpha's wounds." "She did considerably more than that," Calum said, and the particular quality of his tone when he said it made Sable's eyebrows rise approximately half an inch, which for Sable was the equivalent of a very long stare. The planning took 4 days. In those 4 days, Calum's body finished the last of its healing work. The silver contamination fully cleared, the wounds closed and scar tissuing in ways that would fade to nothing within a week of his return to full activity. He moved through the small cabin with increasing ease and decreasing awareness of the space constraints, which Lyra had noted with a private amusement she mostly managed to keep off her face, because a man of his physical presence filling the space she had lived in alone for 2 years was an adjustment that was happening whether she examined it or not. She was examining it, though. She was a person who examined things. She examined the way the quality of her mornings had changed since he had started helping her with the early rounds of the property, moving alongside her in a silence that was comfortable in the way that only the silences between people who have talked themselves honest can be. She examined the way he listened, which was different from the way most people listened, more attentive and less anticipatory, actually processing what she said before forming his response, rather than simply waiting for the pause that indicated his turn had come. She examined the way he looked at her, and she was careful and precise about what she observed in that looking, and what she did not project onto it, because she had a very good sense of the difference between seeing clearly and seeing what you wanted to see, and she valued seeing clearly more than almost anything. What she saw was a man who was changing, in the fundamental way that very few people actually change, not performing change or describing change or planning change, but being changed, moment to moment, by the accumulation of honest conversations and real work, and the simple, relentless reality of another person's presence. She saw a man who had been one thing for a long time, and had arrived at a crisis that had cracked the foundation, and was now, with what she recognized as considerable courage, even if he would not call it that, standing in the rubble and choosing what to build next. She saw a man who had come to her door as a wolf, and stayed as someone she was having increasing difficulty categorizing in any of the categories she had prepared. She examined all of this with the same careful honesty she brought to everything, and she did not allow herself to reach conclusions that were not yet supported by the evidence. And she continued doing her work and being herself, and letting whatever was happening between them be exactly what it was without forcing it into a shape. This was, she was aware, more emotionally disciplined than most people would manage. She had her grandmother to thank for it, among other things. Sable watched all of this with the assessing intelligence she brought to all strategic situations, and said nothing, which said quite a lot. "Are you on the edge of your seat yet?" "Because I have been. Building towards something, and we are getting very close to the moment where everything changes. If you want to know how this ends, make sure you are subscribed and that your notifications are on, because what happens next is not something you want to miss." The plan that emerged from 4 days of careful collaborative thinking was not the plan Calum would have made 9 days ago. 9 days ago, his plan would have been direct, aggressive, and centered entirely on his own authority and capacity. Return, challenge, subdue, restore order. It would have been the plan of a man who had only one tool, and therefore saw every problem as something that tool could fix. The plan that emerged now was different in its fundamental architecture, built around information and coalition rather than force, around the pack's own desire for truth rather than the alpha's imposition of it. Sable would return first, and continue building the internal network of questioning voices. The inconsistencies in the Setor official narrative would be quietly amplified, the unanswered questions made more visible, the fracture in pack confidence allowed to deepen to the point where it became a genuine crisis of legitimacy rather than a manageable doubt. Simultaneously, contact would be made with the 3 neighboring packs, whose relationships with Iron Peak predated the Eastern Alliance, and who had their own reasons to be concerned about a power shift in this part of the territory. Not to ask for military support. Not yet, but to establish communication and shared awareness, to make Marcus understand that his play for power had implications beyond Iron Peak's borders. And Calum would come back, but not in the way Marcus expected, not in rage and challenge, not in the blunt assertion of superior force that would have been his instinct before. He would come back in the moment when the pack itself was asking the question of what had actually happened, when the ground had been prepared by the truth spreading, of its own weight, and he would stand before his people and tell them everything, including the parts that reflected poorly on himself, and he would let them decide. That is an enormous gamble, Sable said, on the last evening of the planning, looking at him across Lyra's table with the directness he had always valued. Yes, he agreed. You could lose. Yes, and you are willing to accept that. He was quiet for a moment. He had thought about this, in the way that he thought about things. Now, which was more slowly and more completely than before, with more room for the uncomfortable parts. I am willing to accept that if the pack, fully informed, chooses differently, then my job is to accept their choice and find a different way to be useful, he said. I am not willing to accept that I should lead through the suppression of that choice. That is what Marcus is doing. That is not what I want to be. Sable looked at him for a long time. Something in her expression shifted. The last careful reserve of assessment giving way to something less guarded. 6 years ago, she said slowly. When I first came to Iron Peak, I believed you were going to be a great alpha. Not just a capable one, a great one. And then I watched you and I thought I had been wrong. She paused. I think now that I was not wrong. I think I was just early. Calum absorbed this. He looked briefly at Lyra, who was at her table with her journal, and who had the expression of someone who is not looking up, but is listening with complete attention. He looked back at Sable. I had help, he said simply. Sable very nearly smiled. She came to stand beside him outside the cabin that night, after Sable had gone to her bedroll in the small back room, and they stood together in the cold mountain air, looking up at a sky so full of stars. It seemed like a different sky from the one you saw in populated places, more concentrated and more real. The sky as it had always been before people put lights in the way of it. You are afraid, she said, not unkindly. Yes, he said, without deflection, which was still new enough to feel significant. Good, she said. Fear is appropriate to the size of what you are trying to do. People who do large things without any fear are usually either deluded or reckless. He turned to look at her profile, the clean line of it against the star-filled dark. I want to ask you something, he said. Then ask. Why did you come outside when you heard me? The first night. Any reasonable person would have stayed inside. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke there was something different in her tone. Less the careful precision of a person who monitors their own communication, and more the slower quality of someone speaking from somewhere further in. My grandmother told me when I was 7 years old that there are moments in a life when the world shows you something that requires a response, and that the choice you make in that moment determines more about who you are than almost any other kind of choice. She told me that fear is almost always present in those moments, because the things that matter are always frightening, but that the fear is not a reason not to respond. She paused. I heard you and I was afraid, and I went out anyway. That is the whole of it. He looked at her for a long moment. The stars were very bright, and the air between them was very still, and he felt something that he did not have a name for yet, but that he recognized. In the way you recognize something you have never encountered but always known was coming, something your whole life has been the preparation for. Lyra, he said. I know, she said. I haven't said anything yet. You don't need to." She turned to look at him then, and her eyes were very dark and very clear and entirely unafraid, which he found was the most devastating thing about her. More devastating than her competence or her kindness or the particular steadiness of her presence. The fact that she looked at him, all of him, the alpha and the wounded wolf and the man learning to be something different, and she was simply not afraid. "You don't need to say anything yet. When it is time to say it, I will still be here." He looked at her. The stars moved overhead in their ancient courses, entirely indifferent to the two people standing below them in the cold mountain air, and he thought about fear, and about choice, and about foundations, and about what it meant to build something from the ground up with the full weight of your eyes open. "When I come back," he said. "When you come back," she agreed. The morning Calum and Sable left, Lyra stood in the doorway of her cabin and watched them go until the trees took them. And then she went inside and stood in the middle of the space that was full of him still, the particular imprint that a person leaves in a place where they have healed, and she breathed it in for a moment. Then she went to her workbench and picked up her mortar and pestle and began to grind the dried valerian she had abandoned 9 days ago, and she worked with the same patient rhythm as always, and she allowed herself to feel, fully and without management, everything she was feeling. This, too, was something her grandmother had taught her, that emotions, when you let them move through you honestly instead of holding them at arm's length to examine them, pass through more cleanly and leave you more whole. She had been very disciplined for 9 days. She allowed herself 20 minutes of not being disciplined at all, and then she set the feeling down and went back to work. She had her own preparations to make. The truth about Lyra Ashwood's presence on the edge of Iron Peak territory was not a secret she kept deliberately so much as a fact she had not yet found the context to share. Her grandmother, who had been her primary teacher and the most important person of her childhood, had told her the family's history in the way you tell a child, something important, in pieces, over time, with the understanding that the full picture would only become clear when the child was ready to hold it. The full picture, as Lyra had come to understand it over 24 years, was this. On her mother's side, the family were humans who carried a dormant bloodline that had not, to anyone's knowledge, been active in 3 generations. But dormant was not the same as absent. It expressed itself in small ways that accumulated into something meaningful. If you knew how to look, the healing talent that everyone in the family had in some degree, which was better than talent, and had always been better than talent. A genuine capacity to understand and influence biological systems in ways that exceeded normal human parameters. The way animals responded to them, the way plants grew unusually well in their care, the particular quality of attention that Lyra brought to the world and that her mother and grandmother had also had, that sense of resonance, or recognition that she had never quite been able to name. Her grandmother had told her, on the last day of her life, that the dormancy was ending, that the bloodline had been waiting for the right conditions to re-express fully, and that Lyra was the generation in which that re-expression would happen. She had told her that when the time came, she would know, that the knowing would not be subtle or ambiguous, but would be the kind of knowing that you could not talk yourself out of, because it came from a place that was deeper than argument. She had told her to find the forest, which she had done. She had not told her what to expect to find there. Lyra stood at her workbench and ground the valerian, and thought about the feeling she had had when she put her hand on a dying wolf's ribs 9 days ago. That resonance and recognition she had felt then, the sense of a key in a lock. And she thought about the way her healing had worked differently in those 9 days than it had ever worked before, more immediate and more certain, as though something in her capacity had opened a door she had not known was closed. She thought about the dreams she had had every night since he arrived, vivid and detailed and not quite metaphorical in the way that most dreams are, more like memories of things that had not happened yet. She thought about her grandmother's words. "You will know, and the knowing will not be subtle." "No," Lyra said softly, to the empty cabin and the memory of her grandmother and the feeling still warm in the palm of the hand she had pressed to a wolf's ribs at midnight. "It is not subtle at all. Inside Iron Peak, The fracture was deepening faster than even Sable had predicted. The narrative Marcus had constructed was a story built on speed and shock, on the assumption that Caleb's death, presented as fact immediately and forcefully, would be accepted before anyone had time to question it, and that the subsequent installation of Marcus as emergency alpha would have an inertia of inevitability by the time doubts arose. This was a reasonable strategy for a short window of time. It was not a strategy that held up under scrutiny applied over days and weeks. The questions multiplied. Where was the body? Why had no one outside the ambush team seen the incursion that supposedly killed him? Why had the emergency alpha assumption of power happened with such unusual efficiency, as though it had been prepared in advance? Why were certain members of the pack, members known to be loyal to Caleb, being quietly sidelined or in 2 cases relocated to distant territorial assignments? Each question was individually answerable with varying degrees of plausibility. The accumulation of questions was not. Sable moved through it all with the patience of someone who understands that truth, once it begins moving, does not need to be pushed. She asked questions in the right rooms, and went quiet in the right moments, and connected people to each other in ways that let them draw their own conclusions. And she watched the ground of pack opinion shift beneath the official story, like water finding the weak points in rock. She also sent word to the eastern border contacts she had quietly cultivated before any of this had happened, because Sable was, among her other qualities, someone who paid attention to the texture of the diplomatic air, and who had understood for some time that the Eastern Pack was not the neutral neighbor it presented itself as. Those contacts confirmed what Caleb had suspected. The Eastern Pack had been aware of the conspiracy in advance. They had not initiated it, but they had encouraged it, and the agreement for territorial transfer was real and specific and damning. The pack that had believed itself to be acting for the good of Iron Peak was beginning to understand that it had been used. Marcus was not a stupid man. He had made a catastrophic strategic error, which was not the same thing as being stupid. And he was capable of recognizing it, even if he was not yet willing to name it to himself. He had planned for Caleb's death, and found himself managing Caleb's absence, which was considerably more difficult, because a dead alpha is a closed chapter, while an absent one is an open question. The open question was growing. He could feel it in the quality of the air in rooms he entered, and the conversations that went quieter when he arrived, and the particular way that people he had counted as certain were beginning to become uncertain. He addressed it the way he addressed most things, with force and with the suppression of dissent, which was effective in the short term, and which was, Delia told him quietly, and without much hope that he would listen, going to make the eventual reckoning considerably worse. He put 2 people under formal censure for spreading doubt. He increased the guard on the territorial boundaries, officially for security reasons, and unofficially because he was trying to prevent both unauthorized people from leaving and unauthorized information from arriving. He sent additional scouts to the Western Territory, specifically to the area where the last trace of Caleb's trail had vanished, with orders that were somewhat vague in their ultimate intent, in a way that Delia found profoundly disturbing, and that Rowan, who had lived long enough to have seen this kind of thing before, found simply sad. It was Rowan, in the end, who was the crack in the wall. Rowan had been Caleb's father's most trusted advisor for 30 years, and had believed, when he had joined Marcus's conspiracy, that he was acting in the best interest of the pack and in the memory of the alpha he had served. He had told himself that Caleb's leadership was failing, which was true, and that Marcus's leadership would correct this, which he was beginning to understand was not true in any of the ways that mattered. Marcus's leadership was not a correction of Caleb's failures. It was a different set of failures, more cynical and less apologetic, and Rowan was old enough and honest enough to know the difference. He went to Sable on a Tuesday afternoon in the straightforward way of a man who has made a decision and does not require drama to carry it out. He told her what he knew. He told her where the documentation was, the actual written record of the conspiracy and the Eastern Alliance that Marcus had been too confident to destroy entirely. He told her he was prepared to stand before the pack and testify to everything, including his own role. and he asked only that the outcome for the pack be considered before the outcome for himself. Sable looked at him for a long moment. "He is alive," she said. Rowan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the expression on his face was complicated in the way that old griefs are complicated. The grief of someone who had made a serious error while believing they were doing the right thing, and who had now to sit with both the error and the intention, and find some way to hold them together. "Good," he said quietly. "That is good." Calum felt it from a mile away. The change in the quality of the air as they moved toward Iron Peak's center. He felt the pack the way he always felt it. That particular awareness of many lives connected to his own, that was one of the constant background features of his existence as Alpha, but it felt different now. Less settled, more turbulent, the way a body of water feels different when it is being stirred by forces beneath the surface. He felt the division in it, the fracture Sable had described, and he felt something else beneath that, something that might have been the beginning of readiness. The pack's collective orientation toward truth, the way sunflowers orient toward light. He and Sable entered Iron Peak from the north, on foot and in human form, on the afternoon of the day that Rowan's testimony had been recorded, and the documentation had been secured, and the network of questioning voices had been activated into something louder and more public than it had been. The timing was not coincidental. Sable was, among her other qualities, a person with excellent timing. The first pack members who saw him stopped moving completely. He watched it ripple outward from that first point of recognition, the stillness moving through the pack like a wave. People turning toward him with expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to a relief so naked it was almost painful to witness. He walked steadily and without hurry, Sable a half step behind him, and he let himself be seen, all of him, the evidence of his wounds in the way he moved and the set of his face. And he met the eyes of everyone who would meet his, and he did not perform certainty he did not have. Marcus came out to meet him in the central clearing of Iron Peak's main settlement, flanked by his own people, and the moment of their confrontation was nothing like the dramatic dominance challenges of pack. Legend. Marcus looked at Calum, and Calum looked at Marcus, and what passed between them was quieter and more devastating than any display of power could have been. The recognition between two men, one of whom had done something that could not be undone, and one of whom had survived it and was no longer who he had been before. "The pack will hear the truth," Calum said. "All of it. After that, they will decide." Marcus said nothing. What he might have said was rendered irrelevant by the pack. Members who stepped forward from behind him, one after another, until the flanking that had seemed like a statement of power became something entirely different, became an abandonment so visible that even the most uncertain members of the pack could read it without any assistance. "If you are not crying right now, I question your humanity. Leave a comment telling me how you are feeling at this exact moment. I read every single one." The assembly of the full pack was something Calum had called only twice before in 6 years of leadership, both times for matters of serious external threat. He had never called it to speak about himself, his failures, his history, the things he had gotten wrong. Standing before the assembled pack in the late afternoon light of an autumn day he had not expected to live to see, he understood that this was itself a symptom of what had gone wrong, that he had kept himself so separate from the people he led that transparency with them had become unthinkable. He told them everything. He told them about the conspiracy, and what had been planned, and what had been done. He told them about the Eastern Alliance, and what it meant for the territory they all lived in, and what would have happened if Marcus had succeeded. He told them about the 9 days in the forest, which he described in the simple terms of survival and healing and clarity, and he told them about what he had understood in those 9 days, about his own leadership, and what he intended to do differently. He told them about the documentation Rowan had preserved and what it contained, and he told them that Rowan had come forward of his own will and would face appropriate consequences for his role while being credited for the choice he had made. He told them that he was not asking them to simply restore him to his previous position and forget that any of this had happened. He was asking them to decide, genuinely and freely, with full information and real choice, whether they wanted to try again under changed leadership. He told them that if they chose differently, he would respect that choice and work within whatever structure they created, because his job was to serve the pack's genuine welfare, and genuine welfare could not be built on the suppression of legitimate choice. Then he stopped talking and let the silence hold. What happened next was not what he had expected, because he had half-expected argument, or divided voices, or the complicated negotiation of a community, trying to find its way through genuine disagreement. What happened instead was that an older woman named Petra, who had been part of the pack since before his father's time, and who had never, in Calum's memory, initiated any public statement of any kind, stood up from where she was sitting, and walked to stand beside him, and turned to face the assembled pack, and said nothing. Just stood there with a quality of deliberate witness that the entire pack felt. 3 others stood within seconds. Then, 7 more. Then the movement became a tide. Lyra arrived in Iron Peak 11 days after Calum and Sable had left her cabin. Not because anyone summoned her, but because it was time. She had known it was time with the quiet certainty of someone whose knowing comes from somewhere reliable, and she had packed what she needed and walked the 6 miles through the forest. She knew well, and arrived at the southern boundary of the settlement with nothing but herself and her supply pack, and the calm of someone who has made their choice completely. The pack noticed her immediately. She had not expected otherwise, had not wanted otherwise, had walked in openly and without concealment, because concealment had never been her approach to anything. She was aware of the quality of attention she received as she moved through the settlement toward the center, the wariness and assessment, and in some cases, open hostility of people who understood, correctly, that this human woman had something to do with their alpha and did not yet know what to make of it. She did not perform confidence she did not feel. She was somewhat afraid. She walked anyway. She found Calum in the main hall, in the middle of what appeared to be a council discussion that had been underway for some time, surrounded by people including Sable and Rowan, and 2 others she did not recognize, all of them looking at maps and documents with the focused intensity of people in the middle of difficult work. She stopped in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt, and one of the people she did not recognize looked up and saw her, and the room went through that process of successive attention she had experienced at the boundary, the awareness rippling inward until Calum turned and saw her. What crossed his face in that moment was not subtle. Sable, to her considerable credit, looked at the ceiling. He came to her, crossing the room with a directness that told the assembled council everything they needed to know about priorities, and when he reached her, he stopped and looked at her. The way you look at something you are relieved and grateful to see, in a way that cannot be organized into composed expression. And she looked back at him with the steady, dark eyes that had always, he thought, seen him more clearly than anyone else had. "You came," he said. "I said I would still be here." She pointed out. "You said you would be here. I did not expect you to come here. There is a difference," she agreed. "I thought it was important. I have things to contribute to what you are building, if you want them. And I thought," she added, with an honesty that cost her something small and real, "that I wanted to be where you are." He reached out and took her hand, and the warmth of his hand around hers was exactly what it had been the first time, but more, deeper, freighted with 9 days of honest conversation and shared silence, and the particular knowledge of someone you have seen both broken and becoming. And she let herself feel all of it without management. Behind him, she heard Sable say, in a tone of extremely controlled dryness, "If everyone could give them approximately 3 minutes, I think the rest of us could get back to the territorial maps and pretend this is not the most obvious thing that has happened all week." Lyra almost laughed. Calum's expression did something that was unmistakably a smile, full and unguarded, the smile of someone who has stopped performing and started being, and she found it so completely disarming that she had to look at it for a moment, the way you have to look at something very beautiful before you can look away. "The council is going to have opinions," he said. "I can handle opinions," she said. "I know," he said. "I was warning them." The integration of Lyra Ashwood into the life of Iron Peak was not smooth or immediate or without conflict, because meaningful things rarely are. There were members of the pack who were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a human having any meaningful role in pack governance, and their discomfort was not entirely irrational, being rooted in centuries of history between supernatural communities and humans that was considerably more complicated than simple prejudice, though it contained prejudice as well. There were members who were uncomfortable specifically with the nature of what Calem's relationship with Lyra seemed to be becoming, with what it meant about their alpha, and about what the pack might be under his leadership going forward. There were members who were simply resistant to change in the general way of people who have organized their identity around a particular set of arrangements and feel threatened when those arrangements shift. Calem did not suppress these concerns. He took them seriously, and he addressed them directly, in individual conversations and in open forums, with the honesty that had become his primary leadership tool in the weeks since his return. He acknowledged the legitimate history behind certain fears. He was clear about what he was, and was not asking the pack to accept. He did not ask them to pretend that Lyra being human was not a complication. He asked them to consider what she was in her own right, and what she contributed, and whether those things had value, and to make their judgments based on what they actually saw, rather than on what they had been taught to expect. Lyra made her own case, which she did primarily by being exactly herself, which was her only real mode of operation. She brought her healing knowledge to the pack's medical needs without ceremony or condition. She learned the names of the people around her with genuine interest in the individuals behind the names. She asked questions that were perceptive and offered observations that were useful, and she never, not once, used Calem's position as a shield or a shortcut, which the pack noticed. The pack noticed everything. She also, within the first month, did something that made the discussion considerably more complicated for everyone involved, which was to heal a child who had suffered a severe silver contamination injury through an incident with an industrial site at the territorial edge, a child who was not expected to survive. She healed him with a combination of her remedies and something else, something that the attending pack healer watched with careful attention and described afterward as a channeling of biological energy, so precise and so powerful that it went beyond any human capacity she had ever seen or heard of. The child recovered fully in 3 days. The pack healer reported what she had observed to Calem and Sable, and 3 of the elder members. The conversation that followed was the moment at which Lyra told Calem what she had told no one else, the full story of her family and her bloodline, and the dormant heritage that her grandmother had told her was ending. She told it plainly and completely, sitting in his office with the door closed and the autumn wind against the windows, and he listened with the complete attention she had always valued. And when she was finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "You knew something was different about you," he said finally. "I knew something was different," she agreed. "I did not know the full scope of it until recently. Until 9 days in a forest, perhaps." She met his eyes. "Until then," she said. "What does it mean?" he said. "For you. Not for strategy or politics. For you." She thought about this, giving it the real consideration it deserved, rather than a prepared answer. "It means I am more than I thought," she said slowly. "It means the things I have always been able to do are not accidents or anomalies. It means the forest I live in, the animals, the plants, the healing. It is not just something I am good at. It is something I am." She paused. "It also means that what happened when you came to my door was not chance. Not entirely." He nodded slowly. "The wolf went to you," he said. "Not randomly. Not just because there was a light on. Something in me knew where to go." "Yes," she said. "I think that is right." He looked at her with an expression that she had come to know as him working through something honestly, rather than performing a conclusion. "That could mean many things," he said. "I don't want to assume. It means," she said carefully, "that there is something between us that is old and real, and that predates both of us making any choices about it. And it also means that the choices we make about it matter completely, because the old real things are the foundation, not the building. We are the building." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the autumn light, while the wind moved outside, and the pack that was learning to be something new went about its complicated healing work. "Then let's build something worth having," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's." You know what is remarkable about a story like this? It is not the supernatural elements, though those matter. It is not the conspiracy, or the power struggle, or the political intrigue, though all of those are real and significant. What is remarkable is this, that a man who had built himself into something invulnerable went through the one experience that invulnerability cannot survive, which is being completely broken down, and found on the other side of it not emptiness, but, the possibility of something more real than what he had been before. And that the person who held space for that possibility was someone he had been taught his whole life to discount. A human woman living alone on the edge of his territory, who turned out to be carrying a heritage and a power and a quality of seeing that he needed and did not know he needed. This is always how it is, isn't it? The things we need most come in forms we haven't prepared to receive them. The Eastern Pact negotiation took 6 weeks and was resolved without violence, which was itself a statement about what Iron Peak was becoming. Calum went to the table with full documentation of the conspiracy and the alliance and the territorial agreement that had been drafted, and he laid it out without accusation or ultimatum, simply as a statement of what had been attempted and what the consequences of pursuing it further would be. And he offered instead a different kind of relationship, a genuine mutual recognition. Agreement built on transparent terms and actual shared interests, rather than the exploitation of internal instability. The Eastern Alpha, who was calculating if not wise, made the calculation correctly. This Calum Voss was not the same Alpha who had been ripe for removal 3 months ago, and the pack behind him was not the same fractured community that Marcus had promised would fold without resistance. The agreement they signed was not perfect. It was a beginning. Marcus, Delia, and the 6 additional conspirators faced a restorative justice process that Calum had developed with significant input from Lyra, and from Sable, and from Petra, the elder woman who had stood up first in the assembly, and whose wisdom had turned out to be considerably deeper than her silence had suggested. The process was not punitive in the traditional pack sense. It was demanding in ways that punishment often is not. It required genuine accounting, genuine acknowledgement of harm, genuine participation in repair. Some of the conspirators engaged with it more honestly than others. Marcus engaged with it least of all, and the result for him was exile, which was his choice as much as the pack's. Rowan, who had engaged with the most complete honesty and who had taken the most significant risk in doing so, received a different outcome: a reduced role, a period of supervised service, and eventually, over time, a partial restoration of standing that was earned rather than restored by fiat. He was, in his final years of active pack life, one of the most respected elders Iron Peak had, not because he had been powerful, but because he had demonstrated what honesty and accountability actually looked like in practice, and this turned out to be more valuable than authority. And Lyra, what can I tell you about Lyra that you have not already understood? Watching her move through this story with the particular quality of presence that has always been hers, the patience and the seeing clearly and the refusal to be afraid of things simply because they are large or complicated or require more of her than she expected. She built her new life in Iron Peak the way she built everything, steadily and practically, and with genuine curiosity about what it was becoming. She established a healing center that served both pack members and the humans in the surrounding area, which was itself a kind of statement, a physical expression of the belief that the separation between communities was not a natural law, but a historical arrangement that could be changed. She trained apprentices, 2 from the pack and 1 from a human family in the valley, with the same patient transmission of knowledge that her grandmother had used with her, understanding that the most important thing you can give a student is not information, but the quality of attention that lets them find their own wisdom. She and Calum built their relationship the way he had said, as a construction, careful and chosen, and always subject to revision and honest examination. They fought occasionally, because they were both people with strong views and genuine convictions, and because the most important relationships always contain real friction, and to pretend otherwise is to pretend you are not both fully yourselves. They came back to each other after the fights with more knowledge than they had before, which is the only thing that makes the friction worth it. They built something that was, as Lyra had described, grounded in something old and real, but built by the choices they made every day. And it was worth having. And they knew it was worth having, which is perhaps the greatest luxury that exists. On the first anniversary of the night Calum had come to her door as a dying wolf, Lyra stood in her original cabin in the forest, which she had kept, because some things are too important to leave behind entirely. And she stood in the space where she had worked through a night to keep a stranger alive, and she felt the full weight of everything that had grown from that night, all of it. The love and the difficulty, and the transformation, and the loss, and the extraordinary ongoing project of building something real. She put her hand against the stone wall where she had hung his chart that first morning, the careful record she had kept of his vital signs and his medications, and the progress of his healing, and she felt the same thing she had felt the first night when she put her hand on his ribs in the dark, that resonance and recognition, that sense of a key in its lock, but it was larger now. It extended further. It included the pack that was becoming something better, and the apprentices she was teaching, and the agreement signed with the eastern border, and the elder woman Petra, who had taught her 3 things about mountain herbs she had not known, and the child who had recovered from the silver contamination, and was now, a year later, learning to shift for the first time, with the wondering joy of being discovering something fundamental about what they are. All of it, from this. A wolf who had come to her door refusing to die. A woman who had gone outside anyway. She stood there for a long moment in the evening light. Then she heard the sound of footsteps she knew perfectly well. And she turned. And Calum was in the doorway with the expression he had worn the first time he had almost smiled. That movement in the corner of his mouth that had felt unfamiliar to him then, and felt entirely natural now. And he looked at her, the way he had been looking at her for a year, with the particular quality of a man who has arrived at the thing he did not know he was looking for, and has decided to stay. "I thought I would find you here," he said. "You usually do," she said. He crossed the cabin and stood beside her and looked at the wall where she had hung his chart, and then he put his hand next to hers against the stone, and they stood there together in the last of the autumn light, in the place where everything had begun. "Are you ready to go home?" he said. She looked up at him. The light was golden, and the forest outside was the forest she had always loved, full of the silence she had learned to read, and the life she had learned to tend. And it was home. It had always been home. But so was the place they were going back to. So were the people who would be waiting. So was the particular space that existed in the world where he was. "Yes," she said. "Let's go. Home. This is where I leave you today, in the best possible place. At the beginning of everything they are going to build together. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath in the dark with Lyra, or feeling something shift when Calum said things he had never said to anyone, please leave a like and tell me in the comments which moment got you most. Was it the first night? The night under the stars? The assembly? I want to know. And if you are new here, and you want more. Stories like this, stories about transformation, and found strength, and the extraordinary things that happen when people choose to see each other clearly, instead of strategically, please subscribe and turn on your notifications because there is so much more coming, and I would hate for you to miss any of it. Thank you for spending this time with Lyra and Calum and the pack that learned. Too late to stop it, and just in time to benefit from it. That what looked like weakness walking into their Alpha's life was actually everything they needed to become what they were always meant to be.